On December 29, 1808, in a cramped two-room log cabin near Raleigh, North Carolina, Andrew Johnson entered a world of crushing poverty. The kitchen where he drew his first breath sat barely a half-block from the state capitol, yet his family existed in complete obscurity, unknown to the political elite who governed just steps away. His father, Jacob Johnson, worked odd jobs as a porter at a local inn, scraping together barely enough to feed his growing family. His mother, Mary Polly McDonough Johnson, labored as a seamstress and weaver, her fingers perpetually raw from needle and thread. Here was a boy whose father would be gone before he turned 4 years old. When Andrew was just 3 years old, his father made a fateful decision that would seal the family's desperate fate. Attempting to save several well-to-do employers from drowning, Jacob Johnson exhausted himself so thoroughly that his body never recovered from the ordeal. He died in January 1812, leaving his widow and 2 sons, William and Andrew, completely destitute in a society that offered no safety net for the poor. The loss plunged the already struggling family deeper into despair, transforming young Andrew's early memories into a blur of deprivation and hunger. With her husband gone and 2 mouths to feed, Polly Johnson had few options available. The established social order of early America left little room for a poor widow and her children to escape their circumstances. She remarried shortly afterward to turn a Daughtry, but even this union could not provide the stability the family desperately needed. The poverty of these years marked Andrew profoundly, burning into his consciousness a fierce determination to rise above his circumstances and never forget what it felt like to have nothing. His childhood was stripped of innocence and replaced with the harsh realities of economic struggle. This early deprivation would shape every decision he made, every political position he took, and every principle he claimed to champion throughout his entire life. The memory of poverty became his greatest teacher. When Andrew Johnson reached his early teens, his mother faced an impossible choice that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of his life. With no formal employment secured and no family fortune to depend upon, she made the practical decision to bind her son to a local tailor named James J. Selby. At approximately age 14, Johnson began his legal apprenticeship, agreeing to serve Selby until his 21st birthday, in exchange for learning a skilled trade that might eventually support him. The needlework of his hands would become the foundation of his education. Life in Selby's tailor shop was austere and confining, but it proved to be Johnson's unexpected pathway to learning. While one of Selby's employees taught him rudimentary reading and writing skills, something far more valuable occurred daily within those shop walls. Educated men from throughout Raleigh would come to have their clothing mended and altered, and some of them developed the habit of reading aloud while the tailors worked. Literature, newspapers, and political speeches resonated through the shop as needles flashed and cloth accumulated around the workers' feet. Young Andrew listened intently to every word, absorbing knowledge through his ears, while his hands mastered the precision required for fine tailoring. This unusual education proved formative. Johnson developed an early and lasting love of literature and learning, drawn particularly to political discourse and speeches. His biographers have noted that Johnson's later reputation as a gifted public speaker may have originated in these formative years, where he learned to listen carefully and absorb the cadence of eloquent language while threading needles and cutting fabric. The combination of practical skill and intellectual exposure created something unique, a working-class boy developing the mind of a scholar. However, the apprenticeship system itself felt suffocating to the young, ambitious Johnson. After approximately 5 years of working for Selby, his desire for freedom overcame his commitment to the contract. In 1824, Andrew and his older brother William made a desperate decision together. They ran away from their legal apprenticeship obligations. James J. Selby, facing financial loss from his escaped apprentices, responded by placing a newspaper advertisement offering a $10 reward for the return of 2 apprentice boys, legally bound, named William and Andrew Johnson. The brothers, now fugitives scattered in different directions, determined never to return to their masters' demanding oversight. After fleeing Raleigh, Andrew Johnson became a wandering journeyman tailor, traveling throughout the American South and searching for stability and opportunity. He first moved to Lawrence Courthouse in South Carolina, where he worked independently as a tailor for approximately 2 years, building his skills and gradually saving small amounts of money. This nomadic period of his life remains clouded in historical obscurity, with incomplete records documenting his exact movements and experiences during these formative traveling years. Everything changed when he reached the small town of Greenville, Tennessee in 1826. At 16 years old, Johnson arrived in Greenville with modest savings and a determination to establish his own successful tailor shop. He quickly opened a business, and his skilled hands and fair prices attracted steady customers from throughout the growing community. The shop became more than a place of business. It evolved into a social gathering place where men congregated to discuss politics, current events, and local affairs. Johnson's natural intelligence and listening skills made him a respected participant in these conversations, even though he possessed no formal education, and his reading and writing abilities remained limited. It was within this bustling tailor shop that Johnson's life changed forever when he met Eliza McArdle, the educated daughter of John McArdle, a respectable businessman in Greenville. Eliza was approximately 10 years younger than Andrew, but she possessed the formal education he desperately craved. What began as casual interaction between shopkeeper and customer evolved into a genuine romance, built on mutual respect and shared ambition. On May 17, 1827, Andrew Johnson and Eliza McArdle married, despite the social concerns some townspeople expressed about the match between an uneducated tailor and an educated woman from a more established family. This marriage transformed Johnson's trajectory entirely. Eliza devoted herself to teaching her husband everything her formal education had provided: reading, writing, arithmetic, history, and law. She hired people to read to him while he worked at his tailoring, expanding his knowledge systematically and deliberately. Under her patient instruction, Andrew Johnson overcame his educational deficiencies and developed into an informed and articulate man capable of engaging in sophisticated political discussions. Together, they began raising a family, eventually having 5 children, while Johnson's reputation and financial security grew steadily through his successful tailoring business. By the late 1820s, Andrew Johnson had become a successful and respected businessman in Greenville, and his natural charisma and political acumen caught the attention of local Democratic Party leaders. In 1829, at age 21, Johnson was elected as an alderman in Greenville, launching a political career that would extend from local government all the way to the presidency. 5 years later, in 1834, the now thriving tailor was elected mayor of Greenville, a remarkable achievement for a man who had been born into absolute poverty and never attended school. His rise reflected the democratic ideals of the era and the aspirations of common working people. Johnson's political success stemmed partly from his genuine connection to working-class citizens and partly from his skills as an orator. He championed populist causes and supported states' rights, positioning himself as a defender of ordinary people against the wealthy planter aristocracy that dominated the South. Like his contemporary Andrew Jackson, Johnson presented himself as a friend to the common man, someone who understood poverty and struggle because he had lived it. In 1835, he was elected to the Tennessee House of Representatives, where he served through much of the 1830s and early 1840s, gradually building a reputation as an able legislator. His reputation continued to grow throughout the 1840s and 1850s as he served multiple terms in the House. In 1853, Tennessee voters elevated him further by electing him governor of the state, a position he held for 4 years. The tailor from Raleigh, who had once possessed nothing, now wielded significant political power. In 1857, Johnson was elected to the United States Senate, where he would gain national prominence through his courageous stand on slavery and secession, positions that would ultimately lead to his vice presidency and the presidency itself. When Abraham Lincoln was elected president in 1860, the question of slavery and secession moved from theoretical debate into political crisis. Southern states began withdrawing from the Union one by one, convinced that Republican control of government threatened their institution of slavery and their way of life. By the time Lincoln took office in March 1861, 7 states had already seceded. Tennessee, Johnson's home state, remained in the Union initially, but the Fort Sumter attack in April 1861 pushed most Southern states toward secession. When Tennessee seceded in June 1861, Andrew Johnson made a breathtaking decision. While virtually every other Southern politician abandoned the Union and joined the Confederacy, Johnson remained in the United States Senate, the only senator from a seceded state to do so. His decision to stay stunned his colleagues and outraged his fellow Tennesseans, many of whom now viewed him as a traitor to the South. Johnson received death threats and faced fierce condemnation from former political allies who had supported his rise through Tennessee politics. His decision transcended practical politics. It represented a fundamental moral stance that the Union, even an imperfect one, was worth preserving. Johnson's unwavering loyalty to the Union during the Civil War transformed him into a national political figure. Republicans, desperate to demonstrate that their party represented unity and included Southerners committed to preserving the nation, took notice of Johnson's steadfast dedication to the Union cause. Despite his Democratic affiliation and Southern origins, Johnson represented the possibility of reconciliation and continued unity. By 1864, as Lincoln sought re-election during the Civil War, Johnson emerged as an attractive choice for vice president, a war Democrat who could strengthen the president's ticket and appeal to voters across regional and party lines. On March 4, 1865, Andrew Johnson took the oath of office as Vice President of the United States alongside President Abraham Lincoln for their second term. Unfortunately, Johnson's inaugural day proved inauspicious when he delivered a rambling, incoherent address after consuming whiskey to manage symptoms of typhoid fever. The slurred speech generated immediate rumors that Johnson was a drunkard, a reputation that would haunt him throughout his presidency, despite being fundamentally inaccurate. In reality, Johnson was suffering from illness on that fateful day, and the whiskey had exacerbated his condition rather than representing habitual drinking. Just 6 weeks later, the nation's destiny shifted irrevocably in a single violent moment. On the evening of April 14, 1865, President Lincoln attended a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., intending to relax after the immense stresses of presiding over a nation finally achieving victory in the Civil War. Confederate sympathizer John Wilkes Booth entered Lincoln's private box and shot the president at close range. Lincoln was carried to a nearby boarding house, where he died early the following morning without regaining consciousness. The assassination plot had actually targeted multiple officials that night. Secretary of State William Seward was attacked and wounded, but Johnson's would-be assassin, George Asterot, lost his nerve and failed to carry out his assigned murder. 3 hours after Lincoln died, Andrew Johnson was sworn in as the 17th President of the United States. At age 56, having worked his way up from absolute poverty and complete illiteracy, Johnson now possessed the highest power in the land at precisely the moment when the nation faced its most critical challenge. The tailor's son, who had once struggled to read, now bore responsibility for reconstructing a shattered nation and determining the fate of millions of formerly enslaved people who had just gained their freedom. Johnson moved into the White House with his family, bringing with him Florence and William, African Americans who had belonged to his household in Tennessee. The contrast between Johnson's position as the nation's chief executive and his deep-seated racial prejudices became immediately apparent to observers who understood his personal history and views. The man entrusted with guiding the nation toward justice and equality harbored the very attitudes that had created the devastation of slavery and civil war. President Johnson's Reconstruction policy reflected his fundamental conviction that the seceded Southern states should be restored to the Union as quickly and completely as possible, with minimal federal intervention and maximum leniency toward former Confederates. He issued a broad amnesty proclamation, pardoning all former Confederates who would take an oath of allegiance to the Constitution, though he required Confederate leaders and men of wealth to seek individual presidential pardons. This lenient approach pleased Southern white citizens, but alarmed the radical Republicans who controlled Congress. Conflict between Johnson and Congress became inevitable and ultimately tragic. When Congress reconvened after its recess, Republican leaders discovered that Johnson had essentially completed Reconstruction without their involvement, allowing former Confederate leaders to resume political power and former slave states to adopt black codes that severely restricted the freedoms of formerly enslaved people. The gap between Johnson's vision and Congress's vision of Reconstruction proved unbridgeable. Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866 to protect the rights of formerly enslaved individuals, but Johnson vetoed the legislation. Though Congress overrode his veto and the bill became law anyway, the confrontation established the pattern that would define Johnson's presidency. Johnson embarked on the Swing Around the Circle, a nationwide speaking tour designed to rally public support for his Reconstruction policies. However, the tour proved disastrous, as Johnson faced hostile crowds in many cities who disagreed with his lenient treatment of the South and his indifference to the plight of freedmen. Congress grew increasingly frustrated with the president's obstruction of their Reconstruction agenda, passing the Reconstruction Acts of 1867 over Johnson's veto and establishing military districts to oversee the former Confederate states. The breaking point came when Johnson violated the Tenure of Office Act by removing Secretary of War Edwin Stanton without Senate approval. Congress had passed this law specifically to prevent Johnson from removing Stanton, whom the Republicans valued as an ally in their Reconstruction efforts. Johnson's removal of Stanton provided the legal basis for impeachment. On February 24, 1868, the House of Representatives voted to impeach Johnson, making him the first president in American history to face this extraordinary political trial. The Senate trial of Andrew Johnson unfolded during the spring of 1868, with Johnson's political fate hanging in the balance. To remove Johnson from office, the Senate needed a two-thirds majority, 66 votes in favor of conviction. Johnson's defense team argued that his removal of Secretary Stanton, while perhaps unwise, did not constitute the high crimes and misdemeanors required by the Constitution for presidential removal. As senators deliberated, it became clear that conviction would require near-unanimous Republican support. One Republican senator chose conscience over party loyalty, changing everything. Edmund G. Ross of Kansas became the pivotal figure when he voted not guilty on the primary impeachment charge, joining 11 other Republican senators and all 10 Democratic senators to fall just one vote short of the two-thirds majority needed for conviction. Johnson was acquitted and remained in office to complete his term. Though technically vindicated, Johnson's presidency had been effectively ended. Congress continued to ignore his vetoes and implement their own Reconstruction vision, leaving him a lame duck president with minimal remaining authority. Johnson's term ended on March 4, 1869, and he left office widely viewed as a failure, whose lenient Reconstruction policies had betrayed the Union victory and left freedmen vulnerable to Southern oppression. He returned to Greenville, Tennessee, retiring from political life and attempting to rebuild his reputation among his constituents. For 6 years, Johnson remained largely out of the public eye, but his determination to rehabilitate his political standing never wavered. In 1875, at age 66, Johnson experienced a remarkable political resurrection when Tennessee voters elected him to the United States Senate, making him the only former president to subsequently serve as a senator. Johnson took his seat in March 1875, achieving a form of vindication in his home state, where he had always maintained support among working-class voters. However, this final chapter of his political career proved heartbreakingly brief. In late July 1875, Johnson suffered a severe stroke while visiting his daughter near Elizabethton, Tennessee. He died on July 31, 1875, just 5 months into his Senate term at age 66. Andrew Johnson's legacy remains deeply complex and contested. While historians recognize his rise from poverty as an extraordinary achievement and acknowledge his courageous loyalty to the Union during the Civil War, they consistently rank him among the worst presidents for his obstructionist Reconstruction policies and his fundamental failure to protect the rights and freedoms of formerly enslaved people. The tailor from Raleigh who became president never resolved the contradiction between his populist sympathy for ordinary people and his absolute indifference to the suffering of African Americans seeking basic human rights and dignity in a nation supposedly dedicated to liberty and justice for all.